So, let's say you are, for sake of argument, measuring the amount of conservative and liberal are so not divine terms, but neoconservatives, I guess, at your local college. First of all, how would you set apart? I can't talk. How would you set about doing that? Would you put out a flyer? Because if you did that, it's very likely the ones who are conservative would want to take part in it. The ones who are liberal would not, because there would be discomfort in just a very term conservative on a thing. There would be one or two liberals who would want to prove that there was more liberals, but very likely they would be in the minority. Okay, so scratch that. Let's go about it in a different way. You ask people to get involved. Well, still a similar problem will happen, if not worse, where people will, depending upon how you ask it, be more likely either way to show up and maybe even be more influenced to prove against you. And if they are liberal, act conservative. If they are conservative, act liberal, because they just are at, it's too personal. And it may be somewhat better in regards to things that are more quantifiable, like age. How many people at my college are like 20 or younger? But it's not entirely perfect. For one, there are ways of lying about your age. Maybe if you could go for the effort of proofing every person, you could get over that, but that's just not realistic in that sense. And you certainly can't tell necessarily by looks all the time. I mean, without this beard, I look like I'm like 12. With this beard, it really depends upon what kind of person you are. Just see past the beard and see my face or blah blah blah. So all of that is not necessarily a clear dividing line. It's just there really is no real way to utilize statistics in a perfect sense, which is kind of frustrating because everything depends upon statistics to some degree. At least everything you can relate to back to us, namely psychology and sociology. More so arguably in sociology than psychology, but still to some degree psychology requires some amount of reference points, which comes back to statistics. Even in the more quote-unquote hard sciences, though, I'm not saying sociology is a science, but it's adjacent. Even in the hard sciences, still comes down to statistics to some degree, because you need things to be replicatable. You need to, there's the independent variable and the dependent variable. The dependent variable being dependent on the independent variable. The independent variable is the thing that you don't change in each session. The dependent variable is the thing that changes. For instance, the spontaneous generation, experiment that proved that without flies, or at least proved is a tricky word, but seemed to suggest that flies don't just spontaneously develop in fruit. They have to implant their larva into a fruit. But with that, you know, the dependent variables, how, whether you put what you put under it, what all these things that can change, they're very finicky. They're very, creates very fickle uh, results, even in the small scale, because what's to say, who knows? Like, I'm not arguing necessarily that I think that proved, it's pretty clear, but for sake of argument, devil's advocate, what's to say, like, whatever substance they used to cover, the thing contaminated the fruit and caused, the what's it called, the larva that would have just sprung up out of nowhere to not be able to spring up. Maybe it was there, but just couldn't happen. Or it just maybe was a bad day. Of course, the more experimentation and the changing things makes it less likely. But even then, you could be running down things that you're repeating without realizing it. There's many things that are dependent that are kind of hard because to change, because it just creates, conflict with our human understanding. We don't even realize sometimes what we're replicating until there persists. And just because it proves part of the equation doesn't mean it proves the entire equation. Just because we can prove, for instance, that matter exists doesn't mean matter is what we think it is. Just because we can prove that water is made up of, I think, 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. I think I could be wrong. H2O, yeah, 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part 1 part oxygen in a polar, i.e., imbalanced form. What's to say what hydrogen and water and oxygen really is? I mean, we can prove that all matter is decay forms of other matter. But what does that mean beyond that? Like, the more you look into it, the less and less definitive it all is. Therefore, science, even as it stands, is not an exact science. It's as close, perhaps, to the truth as we can get, but we can only go so far into our perception. And things like quantum theory that seems to be somewhat valid, at least on its face, and I'm not going to go down, because even I would be inconsistent to say that it's definitive, because I just said you never really know. But from all we can say, it seems to be at least somewhat valid, as far as we can tell, in some regard. And if that's true, our whole fundamental understanding is kind of messed up, because things change depending upon its context. It's not just relativity, whereby the perception of time is related to your speed, i.e., the particle is moving in light rather than just sound. But it's somewhat, it's somewhat fickle when you try to advance to the next step in that way. It's kind of impossible to recognize. And I think, I want to say, popular scientists often have fallacious arguments. I'm not saying scientists in general. I've read, as have most people my age, read articles in databases, as you have to do, at least in college, which I didn't finish, but not gonna lie. But I think high school as well. And, if you're really paying attention to some degree, you can notice the difference between the popular scientists and at least a popular scientist when they become famous versus the actual research. It's a lot more less uh, directed and interpretive, more just, it doesn't offer conclusions per se, just the research. But eventually we seek, as is natural, as why would science exist if not for this case, the ends. But that's a measure of philosophy, not reason alone. Not reason, not it is measure of reason, rather measure of philosophy, not truth alone. And not to say philosophy is invalid, but it's necessarily subjective. Science in its purest form would be objective, not subjective. And it's likely that we'll never get to that point, I think, because if we would have to become a hive mind. We would have to just intersperse all the disparate parts and link up to some sci-fi type machinery that would just instill our consciousness into a godly form, or as close as we could get. I mean, as it stands, we're all going to be fallacious in our thinking, just based on the fact that we're human, and not just that we're human, that we have a narrow slice, as they say, of everything. I mean, you look at the Milky Way. No, you can't look at the Milky Way. You look at the stars that envelop the Milky Way around, and from this perspective, we see what looks like to be, and this is not, a unique idea. I'm just, pushing it. You see what looks to be a drinking vessel with the stars linking up. You go several light years away, and it looks completely different. And why I'm saying this is, like, the angle by which we see things just influences its components. And it's not to say that they aren't that in some level on that angle. Space, if not is infinite, is perceivably infinite. And so it's not to say that our angle is wrong, but it's incomplete. We don't have the ability to see everything in an encompassing body. Partly because of how vast the universe is, partly because of how small we are, and partly because it's not necessarily a unified shape as much as we can conceive, like the sphere. It's not a perfect sphere, the Earth, but relatively spherical, contained, mountains here, but water here, but elevations, but still nonetheless conceivably roughly a sphere where we can assign values of north and south, east, west. It's if the universe exists in that way, it's certainly not conceivably in that way. And the universe, from all we know, seems to be expanding too. So it's like, if it is a sphere, it's a sphere that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, and the areas by which it started from are disparate from the areas in which we occupy, and we don't know what still exists from what doesn't exist. And I'm not saying anything that scientists don't, or most scientists, at least, if not all scientists, don't already understand. But we have to remember, not just, we have to really consider everything at all times, that we could be completely wrong in our understanding. Because just because you can prove something, at one angle doesn't mean you can prove it at another angle. You know, I mean, light itself, for instance, is just an illusion. It's a certain wavelength of radiation reflecting, and it can change also depending upon certain circumstances. And there, like that's really the, I think to some degree, even when we're looking at matter under a microscope. Actually, I don't think we can look at pure matter under a microscope, but when we're looking at its extent to which we can see, it's being influenced by so many other things, and it's fickle and changing and morphing. And I'm gonna leave you off with I think what forget he was a great physicist. I think he if he didn't create string theory, I think he was a big proponent of it. But um, let me for a second. I think I can see if I can think of his name. I can't think of his name, but he gives this quote of like electrons act like waves. Like what people think, rather, electrons act like waves. I'm gonna bastardize a little bit, but they don't exactly. People think they act like particles, but they don't exactly. And I don't understand that at all on the level he does. Obviously, I'm not. I didn't go to school for science. I'm a layman, but he at least put it in a way that's understandable enough to like see like this is not simple. It's not just x equals y. It's x counterpart equals y counterpart on this scale, but it references back to a different part. Like it's chaotic, honestly. Um, Perhaps not chaotic to an all-knowing entity if there is one, but chaotic to us, conceivably chaotic. And yeah, it's just I don't know. It's just statistics. All these things. There's limits to them.